The COVID-19 pandemic has changed many aspects of human and social life. This crisis required unusual solutions, regulations, and a strong response to limit the disease spread and protect societies. However, sometimes it was an excuse to introduce oppressive surveillance and undermine human rights, for example, political, social, and cultural rights, the freedom of expression, and the right to privacy. I think that this is a good moment to ask how have the years 2020 2021 changed the world? And it was the main topic of the international conference organized by International Political Science Association Research Committee 26 on Human Rights and the Faculty of Political Science and Journalism, the Adam Mickiewicz University in Poznań, Poland, in December 2021.
In the Research Committee 26 on Human Rights in the International Political Science Association, which I am currently the chair, we had decided that one of the main topics nowadays has been the changes in our societies produced by the pandemic and how has the world changed in the years 2020, 2021. Societies have changed, democracy has changed, human rights have changed, and we think that these topics are interesting to be analyzed in a conference. And it was interesting because it was curious because this conference was planned to be presential in Poznan, but finally, due to this pandemic, due to that world has changed, should be held online.
We experience and we see that in all different other countries of the world, there are some problems with the proper protection of those institutions that do not have their own army, that do not have their own apparatus of coercion, but simply that are delivering a certain result using their, let's say, intellectual potential and their authority stemming from the law. I mean here courts, judicial branch. Judicial branch cannot protect itself from abuses that may happen as a result of legislative actions or as a result of executive branch repercussions. Judicial branch must have citizens that are going to defend judges and that claim that judges are simply important for the operation of the democracy. And I think that what we experience right now is this trend of whether citizens and whether political elites are able to defend judiciary as such. And I said it is not just a Polish or Hungarian problem. Please look that judges have been attacked by Boris Johnson in the United Kingdom. If you if you look into Slovenia, you see emergence of similar problems, and you see that this value of the judicial independence is extremely vulnerable. And one might ask a question: what is the connection between this and other problems I've mentioned before, especially what is the connection between the pandemic and the rule of law? I would say that the first and very obvious connection is lack of accountability for any abuses that have been committed by state authorities during the pandemic. So if you are violating rule of law standards, it means you are creating a system of inaccountability for abuses of your state power. And we had numerous examples in my country of that kind of lack of accountability. The second is even more direct. Please note that one of the responses of the European Union towards the crisis of the pandemic was the introduction of the European Recovery Fund. It is a significant financial instrument, not only because of its size, but also because of the fact that the European Union, for the first time ever, has decided to make a common debt. So it decided to incur a debt in order to sponsor with this debt particular member states. And what happens? Just because of the rule of law crisis, Poland cannot enjoy money from this recovery fund in the same way is Hungary. And I think European Union and representatives of the European Commission are saying even more straightforwardly, listen guys, if you are not going to repair the system of your judiciary, we are not going to give you this money. Because how can we guarantee that this money will be used in a accountable and transparent way, where your judicial systems are not working properly when the prosecutor's office is politically dependent. Moreover, the same argument is presented by European Economic Area and in the context of using the so-called Norwegian funds. So I think that here we see that this connection between rule of law and the pandemic is, I would say, stronger than ever.
I would like to start by saying that it's very much needed at this time around the world to emphasize the importance of the human rights of migrants in a context at which these rights are usually placed in a second position. Security-inspired migration policies prevail around the world, and it's key to revert this trend and ensure that human rights becomes the main focus of the migration policies. Of course, this should be done attending also to security considerations, but not at the expense of the human rights of migrants. I think that the topic that has been assigned to me is a very relevant one concerning the situation of migrants in the context of the pandemic. As you may imagine, over the last 2 years, I have had the opportunity to address this issue on a number of occasions at different fora. I submitted a report about the pandemic and the human rights of migrants to the United Nations General Assembly last October, and along with the Committee on Migrant Workers of the United Nations, my mandate has issued also a number of statements, including a joint guidance note to states to address adequately the pandemic with full consideration of the human rights of migrants, and another statement regarding the right to vaccination for migrants. As a general trend, I would say that the situation of migrants in the context of the pandemic has shown how difficult is the situation for them. I wouldn't say it's something completely new, really. And what we can observe is that many of the restrictions and limitations of the human rights of migrants in the current context of the pandemic are a more acute development of a prior situation or threats.
During this time, there are a lot of different answers provided by the scholars about how the world has changed during these years 2020-2021. I would like to make some remarks. The first one is that we have to learn something that it's obvious, that it's a truism, but we have learned that human rights are vulnerable. The vulnerability of human rights. We are vulnerable to illness and to catastrophes, but we are not aware of this. Now with the pandemic, we are aware that we are vulnerable human beings. Also, we are vulnerable in a different way. We are vulnerable in a global world. We are vulnerable, all the world is vulnerable to a disease, to some disease. some type of disease. Another idea is about we have learned what is a democracy and what the governors are accountable, how the governors are accountable. This is important because the different political systems have reacted differently to the pandemic and have taken decisions. The governors have taken decisions. Okay, what means accountability? Accountability means that you have to take decisions, explain your decisions, justify your decisions, give information about decisions, and be punished or be rewarded by your decisions. This more or less is a concept of accountability. In this case, the governors have to take decisions fast, have to take decisions, difficult decisions, risky decisions. And sometimes not always accountability has been proper, in the sense, for example, that decisions have been taken by governments but not by parliaments, or have been taken not with all the guarantees. There is a discussion in all political systems about the rule of efficacy versus guaranteeism. Finally, there is another aspect. We have learned what are human rights, what human rights consist of. We have to learn what is a right, what means having a right, and we have lived situations in which rights are restricted, has been restricted. We have lived lockdowns, for example. We have different situations now that there are certain restrictions to rights, but we have learned also that in certain situations, certain a state of alarm, for example, what is called the democratic region of a state, in certain situations, certain rights has been to be restricted in order to protect the rule of law. Certain restrictions of rights are justified in order to protect human rights, in order to protect, for example, the life of all the population. Sometimes lockdowns are justified. These ideas are difficult to understand sometimes, and we need to we need to reasoning about these rights, and sometimes some rights are more important than others, and we have to know exactly in every case which is more important. For example, if the right to life, is the right to health, or the right of freedom of movements, or the right of different types of rights that are at stake in this waiving of rights. No? To sum up, we have learned how vulnerable are human beings, what is a democracy, what means governors are accountable, and what human rights consist of. We have learned a lot in 2020 and 2021 about what are human beings, and what is a democracy, and what are human rights.
So how have the years 2020 to 2021 changed the world in terms of human rights? During these years, we saw the advent of the COVID-19 pandemic. And what happens is that the COVID-19 pandemic, especially for the case of Africa, revealed the extent to which the welfare state had degenerated. Consequently, most of the actions towards human rights that were being done by the government were to the benefit of the political elite and not to those who were actually bearing the brunt of the COVID-19 pandemic and its effects.
So, as a researcher, a French researcher living in France and specialist of South Africa, I could compare the two countries. So I'm very grateful to live in France because for me, my rights are respected. In South Africa, there is a very big problem corruption scandals, especially in this context of pandemic. And we can see in South Africa the negative impact on the rights, the right of health for the South African people, and the right of development actually for the South African people. So when I compare the two countries, I can say that we cannot take our rights, our human rights for granted. We need to be careful to know, to have a huge knowledge about our own human rights. When we live in a democratic country like France, even in South Africa, but because of the government behavior, you could lose your human rights quite easily. This is why we need to, because of this pandemic and after, I hope, this pandemic, we need to be careful and as academic to work more and more on human rights topic.
During the COVID-19 pandemic, and particularly during the early stages when many governments have introduced constitutional states of emergency, I think we have witnessed a rise of interpretations of public health protection and security that see these as if they were in contradiction to fundamental rights protection. I have identified this trend in an analysis of Slovak parliamentary debates on emergency legislation. And I think that we can paraphrase Italian philosopher Giorgio Agamben as to how he distinguishes between an emphasis on biological survival as opposed to political life, the latter requiring also the protection of fundamental rights regardless of circumstances. And it seems to me that many political actors have emphasized only biological survival without bringing in an emphasis on political life. Now, I think this trend is worrisome because it implies a risk of undermining the long-term sensitivity of the public towards restrictions on fundamental rights, and also may impoverish the public space for debate. And this is why I think that this is time for democratic actors to step up and highlight such interpretations, such readings of democracy that include public health protection, but that are also in harmony with an emphasis and the commitment to protect fundamental rights.
The issues brought up during the international conference organized by IPSA RC26 on human rights and the Faculty of Political Science and Journalism, the Adam Mickiewicz University in Poznań, Poland, how have the years 2020-21 changed the world, were highly relevant. We do not doubt that the impact of the SARS-CoV-2 pathogen on the world's fate is short of unprecedented. Certainly in modern history, particularly in the historical period that we hold in our memory. It seems that certainly nothing, and the world in particular, will ever be the same anymore. Unfortunately, the emergency was a necessity, though at times it happened to be only a convenient excuse to impose restriction on human rights.